Hey everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Atomo. It's Friday, March 24, in the midst of the global economic warfare going on right now. So, yeah, I'm going to put a cute little banner on this photo that I've been playing with, or on this video that I've been playing with, and we can making a little bit of fun on what's going on. So, no financial advice, medical advice, election fornication advice, legal advice. Just take this for entertainment purposes. What I want to do today is talk a bit about, because we got the froth now about the cocoa bonds or the AT1s, bringing to light the potential of something called perpetual bonds. So it's bringing, hey, there are these things called perpetual bonds. They have been used before. Wartime bonds um, has been name bandied about before, and when you have to raise for setting up a wartime economy. So I just want to go through an article I found with capital.com. And before I get into that, so here's kind of the kind of high level idea, and understand that the technical plumbing in this idea that I'm bringing forward, there are technicalities to it. I'm just going to kind of set up the big pieces for, well, how might we get a central bank digital currency into circulation? So you probably by now have read so much about, oh, central bank digital currencies, it's going to be vouchers, we're going to potentially have programmable money, and you might not be able to have certain services if your social score goes too low. If you mean tweeted on Twitter, then next thing you know it, you can't fly on an airplane, or if your carbon credits are too high, then you can't buy that steak. So how do we get this system into play? Because it would take an enormous amount of work, enormous amount of uh, convincing people through hook or crook to actually give up enough of their rights, perhaps, to jump into this. Well, let's bring this up on the screen. So, article here from capital.com is talking about perpetual bonds, and George Soros has been talking about this. And if you're looking at teams, you have the New York banks with the Federal Reserve on Team USA, and you have George Soros, allegedly the Crown in the UK, Christine Lagarde, and a bunch of other European technocrats that are Team Davos in the European Union. And Team Davos, they would like to have one world government, everybody answering to them. I have a video before about the walled garden comments that were made. Europe is the walled garden, everything else is the jungle, trying to take over the walled garden. So if I were to take that to the next step, then it's like, okay, well, we'll tame the entire global jungle and turn it into the walled garden. That means you have to go out and you have to cut down the jungle. And us little people would then represent the jungle that needs to be cut down. So if you want to start off color revolutions, be pitting, racial groups versus racial groups, class group against class group, Gen Xers versus boomers versus millennials versus Gen Z, and start the froth all of that up. Well, that's a great way of starting to cut down the jungle, especially if the jungle is cutting itself down. That's not the full point that I want to make here, because there's the social fabric that can be distorted and pulled apart, but there's also the financial fabric that can be pulled apart. So this article is back from 2022. So things to note is, yes, the Powell and Fed rate hikes were ongoing at that time. Maybe had 4 hikes maybe in at that time, before coming into the December and the Christmas season. And and Soros has been vocal about this. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's all over the place, saying that hey, there is this opportunity now to potentially issue a perpetual bond. And well, it's desperate times calls for desperate measures, as being said here in the article. So the war bonds are debt securities issued by a government to provide essential finance during times of war. Significantly, they are able to control inflation by removing money from circulation in a stimulated economy. The bonds can be sold directly to the public or traded on the stock market. Okay, so that's the war bond uh, idea. Um, the UK had something called consols before, and consols were these perpetual bonds. And depending on the covenant of the bonds, the consols can be paid out over time, or they're allowed to run for what might be perpetual, but have a very, very long run rate. Um, so the idea here is that if you have the bonds running in perpetuity, so as your government prints money, so they'll do all kinds of silly social spending, pork bills that throw money all over the place, then the Treasury has to finance that, to which then it places the bonds into circulation to which can be purchased. And if there's no buyers for it, then with quantitative easing, what we've seen is the central banks come in and they buy those bonds and issue currency. Bonds become an asset on the balance sheet, currency becomes a liability. At some point, you bring the currency back in and dissolve the bonds, or the bonds roll over. But the perpetual ones, you only have to pay the coupon on. You don't need to pay the principal. It's perpetual. So at what point do we actually pay the principal? Well, we can say never. Hmm. Okay. So here it is, right here. Soros making this suggestion here that the principal never has to be repaid, only the coupon must be paid while the bonds are outstanding. Here is something good to note. He concedes that the current interest rate environment may not seem the best time to issue perpetual bonds because the coupon would be rather high. Yes, part and parcel of the design of what Chairman Powell has been doing. Love him or hate him. You can see this coming, and having potentially a government decide, oh, we'll step into the perpetual bond space. Well, you had the COVID emergency come up, you had the Build Back Better budgets. So if you go back to the COVID times and look at, there was a couple of synchronized political campaigns. I know the Canadian one, I believe 2021, you would see the leaders saying, build back better, build back better. And even Biden saying, it's a great time we could build back better. Um, and so you saw this um, coordinated. I think even Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand did it as well. Build back better. It's a great time to build back better. Well, they go to their World Economic Forum, they go to these seminars in there. So one thing to look at the World Economic Forum as is, well, you get together with like-minded people, especially if you're head of state or you're running a large organization. It costs a lot of money to go there. I looked into it, and for us little people, like even just to get into some of there's a free tier and then there's paid tiers. There's a lot of money that goes into that thing. And so it becomes a club. And that's part of one of the things I didn't like about it when I was looking at it, saying, okay, well, I want to put my voice in, way back in the early days, because I was looking at some of the policies and stuff, and it's like I can write better than that. Okay, I'm going to see what it takes to get in there and start to write the appropriate policy on the excellent first principles and try to sway it in a direction that makes sense. and then realizing that it's like, for me, it's upward of $90 a month. If you want to get into some of those sessions, I think you're looking at a corporate rate of like $26,000 a year or something like that. And there's, as you open up the gates, there's another gate with even more money. I heard some organizations can pay up to $300,000 a year. And once you're at that tier, then you get to sit in the plenary and the special councils that craft some of the policies, to which then get white papered and disseminated uh, to the NPC zombies that walk the web halls, that are not the policymakers, but are ones that just feed me. I don't know how to think. I don't know how to work this stuff out. Just give me the stuff, and then I'll go and install it, like a certain Swedish furniture company when you take their product and put it into play. So, that brings us to, okay, why it matters to have decentralized ways of doing things, so that you can get to the people who are most impacted by what's happening and have them help design policy. And then when you have different groups designing policies and you see what works for one group and what doesn't work for another group, you can get those groups together and they can learn, rather than going up to this centralized entity and then praying at the oracle that you give me the appropriate white papers to solve my problem. But then that usually fails in a complex environment because you can't control all the variables that are going on. Hey, so anyhow, back to this. So yeah, current interest rate might be too high. Well, thank Powell for that. However, this doesn't matter because the bonds can be redeemed after a non-call period and replaced with another perpetual bond with a lower coupon. So he's kind of giving you, well, interest rates are high, but we can have a point where we can twist them into the lower rate ones. It's just a matter of writing up the appropriate terms and conditions of those bonds. And you can go and you can give Soros a call and you'll have his whole team come in and help you out with all that if you want. It's not going to be a good idea for us little people, because he's definitely not some part of the architecture of this is designing it so that when they tabletop game out, okay, well, what's going to happen? Here's how we start into the central bank digital currency. So just say we start to issue these perpetual bonds. So if you have a government that's in power that is writing legislation, especially when it comes to funding bills, and then blowing that way out, think of the $6 to $8 trillion infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better bill that the Biden administration was trying to put forward. Now, if you start to throw that amount of money into the economy, yes, you're going to get rip roaring white hot inflation. All that money has to go somewhere once it starts to circulate through the markets. And as you get that rip roaring inflation, then it starts to set that chain of events. More inflation means, well, I have to issue more debt. People are going to be crying and screaming. We're going to have riots. Well, I'm just going to give funny money. Like UBI is the big one, universal basic income. Well, I can send out universal basic income, link it to the perpetual debt bonds. So as we throw out the money into the market, we start to run up these perpetual debt bonds. So it means there's an underwriter and potential owner of those. Doubt those would ever go to the public. Well, you want to become either um, that if you design the bond so that there's a controlling interest element to it. So if they have to be called in, then in a sense of a default. So let's put this particular game forward where, well, we can do normal bonds that have an expiration and a particular yield. We start to print, and that yield starts to shoot to the moon. But then what we can do is layer it into a special perpetual bond, and I can put that into a company structure outside of the Federal Reserve System and start to build up these bonds. But given that there's a high yield, I can buy them at almost pennies on the dollar. And what happens is now I got a claim on more of the central bank um, monetary units. If you do this like the AT1s and the COCOs, and you do this for organizations that start to become distressed, then if I'm going to bail them out, then the issuance of the bailout goes into the perpetual bond, which I give to the people who are helping to support the bailout. So that means George Soros and company and BlackRock allegedly could line up the interest of these bonds through appropriate lobbying and legislation so that when these companies start to fail and they have these perpetual bonds, that the covenant in the bond says, well, I'm going to exchange them for equity in that company and then gain controlling interests in those companies. So as then I have control of these companies, at a certain point, you got the companies, but now I come back to the the sovereign itself, the country, and as the interest payments become more and more difficult, because if I start to issue perpetual bonds, I still have to pay the coupon. I don't have to repay the principal. But given the spending becomes uh, very significant, inflation becomes very significant, I can start to get more and more of these bonds to the point where now I got a real big default potential. And as long as my people are in government and I hold the bonds and I hold the weight that I can pay these people and I get a Fed chair in play that is under my tutelage, then what I can do is to say, well, we're going to have a debt jubilee. But a part of that debt jubilee is then I can transfer the, I can bail out the country using all of these corporations that I now own that have been failing. So if you get a good, uh, if you get them blowing up in a controlled, orchestrated way. So we think about the banks right now in Europe. That if it seemed that there might have been somebody else, take Credit Suisse for example, or Credit Suisse had the AT1 Cocos. Possibly somebody saw the path to, oh wow, if this happens, this is going to get converted to equity, and then these bonds, these equity holders are going to become, first in line of whatever, entity that we're amalgamating this, when they'll have like a legal right to um, taking over direction of that organization. And most central banks and the banking system are all privately owned. There's a shareholder structure for that. Then, you know, Soros and company are playing their cards right, they could potentially gain those controlling interests. But again, with the Credit Suisse one, those AT1 Coco bonds had a stipulation in them where they could be written to zero, which happened. And ooh, do you hear the screaming? Just go and search on some of the screaming that's happened. That's like, what do you mean it's going to zero or it got wiped out? And Switzerland's like, okay, sue us. Sue us. It's in the covenant of the bond. So these things are also legal contracts, and they can be, given that you have um, people who are not knowledgeable in the financial and legal constructs of these, they can get in there and they can go to an elected official, do the shenanigans that you do with elected officials, get the elected official to sign off on the bill that will charter these things in the way that people like this guy right here can then orchestrate a way that, well, when the eventual inflationary pressures come and the collapse comes, now, since he's in control of the organizations, one of the things that a central bank digital currency, also has, a part of its design, is that your organization that you're with can issue your payroll in central bank digital currency But your organization would then have some rights on the type of currency that they can issue you. So if you have an HR record and it says you've done bad things, you have not played well in the social inclusivity games within your organization, then they can take away your entertainment privileges through the programmable money. So the banking system, or what would be left of it, commercial banks would be demolished, or they would be under pretty much authoritarian control of the people who own those perpetual bonds, because they'll architect the system in that way. Keep an eye out in Europe, and let's watch as this plays out. That the companies and the government can architect the money in a way that it becomes vouchers, and so you can only remit those vouchers based on how good you are and that you haven't been talking bad about the government, and so you'll be able to participate more in the economy. And most companies would be rolled up into larger conglomerates that would then be a part and parcel of the issuers of the CBDC. So we went from running our deficits really high, blowing out whatever bonds that country has and rolling them into the perpetual bonds so we can open up our debt ceilings and then write covenants into those bonds in such a way that we leave them to very specific people or organizations who can collect on those, and at a point where even the coupon on those can't be paid out through the productive capacity of that economy, then it can enact rights and privileges, mostly through what I believe would be a collapse demolition of large organizations who have designed their type of perpetual bonds to give immense control to potentially a controlling other entity that's run by people like this, who design an architect for this, so that when the inflation runs too high, we can then collapse these industries, convert the bondholders into controlling shareholders, and then reform these organizations with the appropriate autocratic authorities. It's basically feudalism 2.0. And for us to participate in the system when we have central bank digital currencies, we're at the whim of the organization that wants to issue that currency. So that's a thought. I wanted to leave you with that. I'll put a link into the article. I think there's some solutioning stuff here, and it goes a bit over what I was talking about, but I just wanted to close the loop on a possible potential dark future that could happen. And as we've seen recently in Florida, Governor DeSantis put forward a stipulation that they don't want central bank digital currencies or digital currencies in that effect, that they're going to keep a physical money. And it's like physical money can't be traced. Okay. And for some part, it's good, because once governments and authorities say, oh, so and so has a certain spending habit, that maps over to, well, here's the criminal activity that the person's buying this. Well, it looks like 80% of the people who follow those purchasing patterns do these particular crimes. So we'll send the thought police and the Ministry of Love out to re-educate those people before they do their crimes. And if they don't confess up to what they're doing and say the appropriate words and phrases, then we send them to room 101 for re-education.